Hi everyone, in this video we're going to be looking at diffusion and thinking about why is diffusion very important in living organisms. In this graphic you can see what is being illustrated as diffusion, so hopefully by the end of this lesson you should be able to confidently describe what's going on here and use all the key words listed here. For this lesson, our learning objectives are to be able to explain that respiration, what we looked at in the last topic, in the last lesson, requires diffusion, explain what that process of diffusion actually is, and be able to explain the role of the semi-permeable membrane in diffusion. So before we get into the lesson properly, let's just recap what's going on. We have seen this series of diagrams before. So over here I have got a beaker of water with some purple dye crystals in here. After 15 minutes, what we are seeing is that color, that high concentration of dye color, has eventually spread out. And this graph is a representation of that. So you can see that at point A, there was a really high concentration of dye. And over that 15-minute period, the concentration of dye spread out and it became less concentrated. So we've gone from a high concentration up here to a lower concentration down here. So just to put this into words, what we are talking about is the process of diffusion, where these dye crystals have moved from high to low concentration. We've covered this before in a previous topic, so this is purely revision. The reason why we're talking about diffusion again in the cells topic is because this is one of the fundamental processes that we rely on in biology, and it's how cells obtain their essential products, such as glucose and oxygen, and how they remove waste products, such as carbon dioxide. So just to recap, diffusion, the definition of it, is the movement of molecules in a liquid or a gas, not a solid, only a liquid or a gas, from an area of high concentration to an area of lower concentration until they're evenly spread out. So you can see in this diagram, these red dots, let's say that they are glucose molecules. They are in high concentration on the outside and lower concentration on the inside. Remembering that glucose is essential for cellular respiration, so they need to get into the cell, they will move by diffusion down its concentration gradient. This diagram is just summarizing again what the semi-permeable membrane is about. Each cell, be it animal or plant cell, has a cell membrane. And if we zoomed in on that cell membrane, we would actually see that it's got tiny holes or pores in it. Now these pores aren't big enough to allow giant molecules to pass through. They only allow small molecules. So the word semi means half. So that just means it lets some or half the amount of molecules through, but not all of them. This is quite an important point in biology. This is why our food, such as starch, which is a very large molecule, must be digested down. So these are glucose molecules. You can see that size difference. Only the large molecules would be able to get into a cell. Sorry, only the small molecules could get into a cell and the large molecules cannot. Just as a challenge for you here, let's look at this image of a volleyball net. What we've got is different balls of different sizes. So we've got basketball, tennis ball, ping pong ball, marble, and a ball bearing. Some of these balls, when thrown at the net, will pass through to the other side, and some of them are inhibited, so that means that they cannot get through. What I would like you to do is to pause the video and see if you can write down an answer to explain why some of these balls cannot get through and yet some of them can. And the challenge is to try and use all of the keywords in this list. Okay, guys, let's see if you manage to come up with an answer. So what we can see is this is modeling diffusion. Diffusion is the movement of particles from an area of high concentration to an area of lower concentration down a concentration gradient. This process is passive. That means that it doesn't require any energy. It just happens passively. And only small molecules can pass through because the membrane represented by the volleyball net here is semi-permeable. So in your answer, you may have mentioned that the large balls, such as the tennis ball and the basketball, cannot pass through the net, whereas these three smaller balls can, because the net is acting like a semi-permeable membrane. All right, so the reason why we are talking about diffusion and ensuring that you have that understanding is because we're going to be looking at it in the context of living organisms. We know that every living organism must have nutrients in order to survive, and it must get rid of unwanted substances, because if they don't, they will build up and become toxic. Single-celled organisms such as this amoeba here, that's the smallest living animal on Earth, it's unicellular, so it's only made up of one cell. It doesn't have an issue with diffusion. And the reason for that is because it's so tiny that in any direction, there isn't too large a distance. So if we look at the surface area, so that's the outside line of that semi-permeable membrane, that would actually be quite large compared to the volume inside the cell. What that means for this amoeba is that oxygen can diffuse into the cell in any direction really quickly, and carbon dioxide, which we know is a toxic gas, can leave in any direction really quickly. So it doesn't actually need some sort of transport mechanism to do that. It can rely solely on diffusion. Up here, I've got a little model of two cubes to represent what's going on. So each cube has 6 sides, but the volume of this cube is much smaller than this one. So the rate of diffusion from the outside to get to that nucleus in the middle is going to be much faster. To get from the outside here to the nucleus in any direction is going to take longer. If we imagine that us as humans are this large cube, we can clearly see that to get to the center of the cell is going to take a long time if we just relied on diffusion. And that is because our surface area compared to our volume is much smaller. So what I mean by that is that we still have 6 sides here, and we still have 6 sides in this smaller cube, but our volume, we have got more stuff inside of us. So it takes longer for oxygen and glucose and those other good things to move to the center of us where we have living cells that we need to supply with nutrients. So we need to think about how we get around this problem. How we deal with the problem of having a smaller surface area to volume ratio compared to smaller organisms is by having a transport system. So if you look at this image here, these are the blood vessels in a human and some of the organs. What we can see is that there's a really dense network of blood vessels. So the tiniest blood vessels that you have, that you can see in your fingers and in your face, these are called capillaries. And they mesh out in a network so that they are in constant contact with every single cell in your body. What that means is that when nutrients are carried in the blood, they can be delivered to cells in every single part of the body. That means we're not relying solely on diffusion to work its way in. We have a transport system that can quite quickly drop off these nutrients. In the second picture, this is a photograph of the inside of your gut, so your small intestine, which sits just roughly where your belly button is and a little bit below. This is like a big bag of sausages, and inside, if you looked inside one of those tubes, you would see these finger-like projections. And that's a really clever evolutionary mechanism. What they do is they present a much larger surface area for a tiny little volume in the middle. So you can see here that every single finger-like projection has got lots of cells on the outside, but a tiny volume in the middle. And that means that diffusion can happen through those cells to that volume in the middle much faster. All right, guys, what you should be able to do now that we've talked through all that is to define what diffusion is and explain how diffusion works through a semi-permeable membrane. And I want you to be able to explain the role of that semi-permeable membrane in diffusion, and I want you to think about how that relates to humans and why we need a transport mechanism. So pause the video here and see if you can address those learning objectives. All right, so hopefully you've been able to address those learning objectives. What I would like you to do now is to stop the video and complete pages 58 to 60 if you haven't already done so. If you have done those pages, before you move on, please check your work. The answers are online on Sector. Correct anything that you've got wrong or that you want to improve on before we move on to the next section. Okay, guys, in this section, this is on page 61 of your booklet. We're going to be looking at an experiment that illustrates diffusion using our circumference and using a capillary network. So I'd like you to watch the video and fill out the pages on 61 and 62. This should be pretty straightforward, but remember, you can ask me questions if you're not sure about what's going on, or better yet, ask each other and see if you can get a discussion going. Okay, so now that you've watched that video and hopefully filled out pages 61 and 62, let's talk about what this experiment was demonstrating. So you had two Petri dishes filled with agar jelly. Remembering that agar jelly has a semi-permeable membrane, so that means that small dye molecules can pass through them really quickly and easily. One Petri dish just had a circumference cut into it, and that dye was placed in the circumference. The other one had a capillary network, so that was modeling the blood vessels in the human body. What we saw was that the capillary network achieved much faster diffusion. And what that is relating to is this idea of surface area to volume ratio. So the bigger an organism gets, the surface area to volume ratio gets smaller or decreases. So really what we want to take from that is that the rate of diffusion will not be fast enough to meet cell requirements. So if we had the center of our Petri dish is where we needed the glucose and oxygen to get to in this case, it would get there much faster with the capillary network rather than that circumference on the outside. Large animals such as humans or any other animal that you see, it requires a complex circulatory system so that we can get all that good stuff to our cells fast and get rid of all the waste products quickly also. Remembering that we also have a large surface area to volume ratio, so inside of our guts, for example, we have those finger-like projections that increase the surface area, but the transport mechanism is what's really important here. All right, guys, that's the end of the lesson. please make sure that your booklet is up to date and you have self-assessed, and don't forget to do the short quiz that is on sector for you.